The time clock has started for the next section on really simplifying, operations with automation. I think sporadically throughout either the keynotes this morning, the previous panel, when we start thinking about storage and how does modernization, whether it's from the storage kind of protocol aspect to just people and process, and what is the robotics process automation of taking the processes and how do you take the business level and really come down into the technology aspect. It is about that communication barrier. And I think if we heard some of the things this morning, there is still some gaps between just throwing more technology and trying to solve a technology issue back into, is that what the business needs to achieve to make them more effective or give them better information or business insights around the data that is happening in those underlying infrastructure. So it is a kind of a two-way process or approach. We can give them the technology's there, but we really need to understand the problems that the business is trying to solve. Else we're just throwing just another technology, another innovation, another place to access that information, which from a business aspect might potentially make even more complicated solutions as they start to get that data or they get more data around that. So when Brocade kind of started down the making things simpler from a fabric or a networking aspect, and when you think about Brocade, from a system level play, which you heard this morning from the keynote, we really sit between your storage infrastructures and the compute infrastructure. We're that kind of high-speed networking fabric to move data from storage to compute, where all your applications are sitting, or it's taking the data back in from some of the edge devices that are coming back into the data center that are going to sit on some type of storage platform. So the nice thing with sitting in the middle is we see all traffic and all data flows. Now, there's some correlation that automation is going to help us solve on being able to pinpoint what flows are happening within the infrastructure and where those applications are sitting, and can we do some automated things underneath to really help drive those newer high-performance workloads where they need the data almost in real time versus the example I think we heard in the previous session. Well, I have a database with a bunch of assets. We can put those on that slower kind of virtual highway lane to make sure the faster cars don't get mixed in with the slower ones. So as we continue with our strategy, it's all about making things easier. In the previous session we heard, we have less people to manage storage. So we got to continue to innovate the storage to make it simpler, but we also need to provide those building blocks or the fundamentals for storage admins to take advantage of automation. Most storage admins are not traditionally programmers or write a lot of code. They're used to a lot of CLI-based bash-type scripting. So just because we can now do things in Python or Perl or Ruby doesn't mean a storage administrator is just going to jump on that bandwagon and say, well, let me write all these applications to make it easier, because that's a learning curve. That's a change. So when we looked at the strategy, first of all, we want to open up the foundation of the automation to make it simpler and easier, but provide multiple ways to achieve that, which we'll discuss in the presentation. This is just some market stuff when we think about just the overall complexity, less people. One of the biggest things that we found, through some of the analysts and so forth, these environments, as we continue to throw more technology at it, they're still very human-driven and potentially error-prone on configuration. Either they know the process so well that it becomes so mundane, like Chip mentioned this morning in the panel, that sometimes they forget a step because it's just a routine. Like waking up in the morning, getting your breakfast, going to the car, getting into the office. You just go through the motions. And the problem is if you forget a step, potentially now you've opened up a security violation or something in that infrastructure for access to a user or an outside user that now can gain access into that information. So how do we take the process of the steps that have to be completed, which in the government space or the agency space, how do we take the less value work? It's still important, but how do we automate that side of it So again, they can go focus on the high value work or more the strategic or bringing the organizations together, the business and the technical side, to continue to reduce that complexity, which will allow them to do more with their business as they look at hybrid IT, multiple storage platforms, modernized workloads as AI and machine learning and big data and telemetry information, bringing that back together. So the three areas that Brocade really focused on, first, opening up the APIs. So if a customer or our partners in particular want to communicate to the network to get data, whether it's performance data, more operational health type information, maybe it's configuration data for a different set of database, we'll open that up, the full authority to come in, communicate through the RESTful interface to get that data, take the data, put it into their own data lake or their own data fabric. So now different organizations have a way to access that information depending on their role that they're trying to solve. And again, it's all aspects of kind of that storage area network infrastructure. But we didn't stop there. We wanted to make it easier, again, for the storage administrators that are working within this environment. So how do we kind of put that abstraction layer in there and really have the Kickstarter kits for automation? So when they run a PyFOS utility, it bunches a bunch of kind of the underlying things that traditionally, let's say they would do through CLI. They still can execute those through a command line style interface and get the output just in a new modern way versus getting it through text-based through CLI. They now have the XML or JSON, or they can take that data and put it in an Excel spreadsheet. Since they still do a lot with Excel spreadsheet for management and inventory. So single command, we've kind of did the utility, the framework, they get the data back, they put it in the source of information that's most comfortable for them, or again, the team that wants to utilize that. When we look at the larger processes, what are those third-party kind of community-driven platforms that do multiple different aspects of an infrastructure or a platform, and can we build templates of the networking side so they can incorporate it into an overall workflow. So if they're doing a new app deployment and they have a bunch of hypervisor or container type services for deployment, what do they need to do on that physical network down into the storage, and how do they tie multiple kind of templates together to create that workflow? So one area we're looking is to provide the Ansible. Some organizations will have their own kind of orchestration tool. The other area on the community side is tying back into our partners and our OEMs. So they all have platforms to do storage-based management or hypervisor-based or cloud-based management. So again, providing that framework into their tools to provide the information as they so fit for their customers to drive that innovation. The three main buckets that Brocade kind of focused on as we rolled out our RESTful interface and our utilities really broke down in three main areas. Provisioning, so when I bring in a new asset, how do I make sure I can deploy this asset consistently and make things easy no matter how I want to deploy that architecture? So the first aspect is provisioning, which is really as they get into a production environment. And then the last two are more read-only type operational data that they can get back. So after the infrastructure is running, or they want to start doing more correlation of the traffic flows and so forth, more getting monitoring information, and then just kind of basic inventory as some of our larger environments are hundreds of thousands of ports, being able to get a good grasp of what's happening in that environment at any given time, and help with just overall inventory as they decommission devices, make sure those devices are no longer being within the environment, no longer showing up in reports, even though maybe the device has been gone for 6 months or 9 months, which makes the data kind of stale or old in some of these traditional kind of run once type static reporting mechanisms. So three main areas that we really focused on to give the data back to the user in a kind of simple manner. So from a deployment or kind of a hierarchy, if we think about it that way, The first bottom layer, right, we had to expose it within our operating system, no different than any vendor. If you don't expose that interface through the operating system, devices do not have a modern way to to go get that information. It's all kind of proprietary-based communication protocols. So opening that up through our APIs with the RESTful interface. Again, that abstraction layer, the PyFOS, which I mentioned, is another way for more probably storage administrators to use utility-based to be able to communicate rather than at the RESTful interface writing a full-blown application or program with multiple lines of code, which then, again, the storage team needs to communicate to a DevOps team or some type of programming tools team, tell them, explain what this means in the storage world. This is what it means kind of over in a programming world. And then on the other side, whether it's the partner tools, again, they have multiple ways. They can either go through the utility natively to the API, or they have the flexibility of going through our management platform called SandNav to get some of that API or what we, potentially down the road, some functionality or streaming functionality around performance and statistical information from the platform. So again, providing options. Because when we go out and do the research with our customers and try to figure out the right approach, a lot of our customers have different ways to solve the same problem. Our key is, we want to provide that flexibility no matter how they want to get to that end state. We'll give them multiple pathways to get there and multiple flavors of development and engineering resources to make it appeal within their environment. As I mentioned with the utility side, a little bit more technical on this side. As I mentioned, abstraction from a programming aspect with the utility goes down, again, talks to the native through the API. We have a number of these utilities out on our GitHub site, which is open communication kind of libraries out there. We also have a community-based effort as well. So as our customers potentially write some simple applications, they have the ability to go put those out onto the community site so they can kind of share some different examples. A lot of the ones today have been driven either through joint partners of ours. So how do we tie some of the things the storage vendors are doing with the networking side? So as they provision storage, now they have the flexibility to provision the network at the same time, or potentially our use case driven scenarios, which I'll get into. And then a whole number of useful utilities. And again, these utilities are utilities that our customers told us that these are the ones that we do on a daily basis, help us solve this or streamline it. So instead of running 25 CLI commands, we can shrink this down into one executable or one utility CLI style string, and I can either go do the configuration or I can get that data back, but just in a new modern way versus doing text, kind of screen scraping to get some of that information, where if we change anything on our end, now those kind of text strings or responses change, and then the user has to go back and change that, at least through the programmable way. As we make changes, the application can change with us to go get the data as we add new things. As you heard the innovation before this, new protocols coming such as NVMe, how do we start looking at getting that data, traditional FCP data, FICON data for the mainframe side, and NVMe-based protocols, plus other protocols that we haven't seen yet that continue to enhance that and making it easier through the utility approach. From the Ansible kind of workflow aspect, which I talked about earlier, being able to have these playbooks, have these run books, and again, just streamlining the deployment process really across silos of a traditional IT infrastructure. So, working with the compute team, the hypervisor team, how is this storage going to get, configured from a storage array aspect? How big is it going to be? A lot of this starts going into that self-service type model of as changes are happening on either side of that network, we have the flexibility to change the network through an automated process to make sure the ports are online, device A can see storage B, and they don't have to go to that physical network and say, oh, let me, enable these connections, or let me zone so I can communicate with each other. All that happens in the background, part of this workflow process. So Ansible is one way to do this. Again, from a customer standpoint, some of them have their own tool frameworks that they'll write into, or some will use what's readily available within the industry, such as Ansible, to achieve that. Our goal is we provide the templates that matter, and we're still continuing to get that research from our customers on what do they want to try to solve, and we'll continue to help them, enable them, or really give them the Kickstarter kit to help guide them, and they can make the last few changes that they would need to make it their own for their own environment. But we'll try to give 80 to 90% of that template to them. They make the small last little changes within that overall environment. So when we think about use cases, and we heard a lot today about just throwing technology, but again, when my organization goes out and talks to our customers or within the federal space, it's all about, can we build or innovate on something to help them solve a problem? And how do we help them get to that endpoint effectively, or really optimize that journey or that path to get there? And one of the biggest things that we're doing around automation, we want to focus on use case driven simplification. You give us a problem, we'll figure out if we can solve it through automation. And again, whether we do it through the native API that go give you that data, or provide you those starter kits, we're going to provide a reliable pathway to get there. So one aspect that we found on the storage side is, again, the rescaling. We heard a little bit this morning on the humanization of some of this. How do they change? Can they change fast enough as we continue to innovate technology and do it with less people? So the one thing that we're really focusing on, again, not the DevOps style organizations, because they know how to program. We just bridge those together and they can go write all the code for the storage team or provide that tool set. But we have a lot of non-programmers in the traditional storage arena that maybe, obviously took coding back in college, but maybe they're not proficient, in Python and some of the new modern languages, which takes time to go learn it, and the company has to, or the agency has to provide that education and so forth. So what we want to provide is really turnkey solutions for automation for non-programmers. So we'll provide you, in this example, as we look at new modern ways beyond just hypervisors. So what are agencies, or on the commercial side, what are they doing with container-based architecture? So almost every organization has a tools team, or they're doing some of their microservices with containers now. So we want to provide singular use case examples that all they have to do is spin these up in a container environment. As they're done, the container goes away. And it is very specific to particular use cases. So either deployment use cases, or maybe they want to check against something more inventory related, or they want to spin it up and just get a health check on their fabric. When the application's done, it spins it back down, so it's not consuming resources all the time. But it's really the easy button, if you think about it, because as the container is up, it's single line execution. You get the data in the format that you want, and then you can go utilize that data depending on what source of information you're looking for. So for people that are moving to the container world beyond just the hypervisor world, we'll provide that avenue as well for specific use cases. And the first two that we're going after, and this is driven largely by whether it's an agency or really on the commercial side, from an auditory and regulatory aspect, is we've done the initial configuration. We have that process down. Here's the 100 things that we go do every time we deploy into this environment. But what happens as things change over time? So I'm a user, and I need to get onto the environment. Traditionally, Telnet's disabled for security reasons. But the easiest way for me to get to that switch is I unblock Telnet, I get onto it, I do my quick changes, and then as a good user, I should re-block Telnet But sometimes people get rushed and a phone call happens or they move on to their next meeting. They forget to re-disable some of these critical security parameters within their environment. So what this does, it goes out and checks drift. You heard this morning having that light that goes off to if something happens, or maybe you get the email saying, your environment, here's your report, these things are now, what you've deemed as a security issue, have changed. And you can run this, especially in a modern type automation world, you can run this every 10 seconds, you can run it once an hour. Again, depending on the criticality of the environment, a lot of flexibility as we look at the automation and through the APIs. But again, this runs against a known set of what it should be. Here's everything that's changed. Now it's up to the user to say, oh, let me go back and get this back to the golden or the good state. So my boss or my auditing side or the lawyers don't come down and say, why is this port open when it shouldn't have been open in the first place? So tying this together with audit logs and some other things, you can go fix potentially a broken process, because good engineers always find ways to get around process. But that also potentially leaves an organization up to some other downstream impacts, especially around auditing and regulatory concerns. So again, this is just one simple example. You can write a full-blown application to go get it through natively, or you can deploy this in a container environment. We'll have this available through the community. You can modify it as you so fit, as long as you can do it within the container type constructs of Docker. But again, it hopefully gets a customer 90% there. They can retweak maybe some of the parameters that they want to look at in this particular use case. But again, that Kickstarter kit to get them down that journey of using automation from a SAN fabric aspect. This one was just the golden configuration. So if I have to run 100 steps every time I go configure, let's make sure it's consistent. If I start consistent in step 1 or phase 1, my consistency, my reliability, and my availability of this environment is going to continue to be stronger as time goes on, versus I have users doing deployment one way in this site, but over in this other location, they have their own methodology, and now we're different, even though the fabrics are supposed to be mirrors of each other. So let's get that consistency up front, which will prevent downstream issues or security or potentially performance issues down the road, which take time to go troubleshoot. It takes resources. So we do it right up front. We can really eliminate some of the downstream impacts of providing the right configuration up front. Again, reducing the error proneness or just forgetting steps throughout that process. A lot of our customers do a lot with spreadsheets. And this is where I was talking from that utility side earlier. As our customers go deploy new assets within their environment, a lot of them still use the old school method of putting everything into a spreadsheet, or they get a report in a spreadsheet format, then they hand it over to another organization, and then eventually it goes back to implementation. A lot of different tools to go do that implementation. But we said, as you're doing this anyways as part of your process, let us just go read that information, and we'll manually or we'll automate this through the fabric. You already know what storage device needs to talk to what host. So we'll automate or read that information back in, and we'll do all the fiber channel or all the SAN configuration for the end user, versus manually having to go create host name, aliases, and zoning information. Because all that's done already on the storage array. It's already documented. We just found a way we'll take that data in and automate the back end. So this is just one example of many with those utilities. And it doesn't have to be an Excel source, right? If there's another source of data, you customize that front-end application to go get that data, bring it back in. And again, as it's writing to that environment, we just take it in and then automate that configuration side. So from a storage standpoint, drastically reduces the amount of configuration work to get into a production or a pre-production type environment. And again, if it's right here, it'll be right on the fabric, and you don't have to worry about a misconfiguration step along the way. Some of the resources that we have available, as I mentioned, our GitHub site. So this is where we're posting all the utilities, whether they're sanctioned and supported by Brocade, or if we want to just put some use cases out there that our customers can get an example of how we kind of did some of these. And then they can kind of make it their own, or maybe it's, strings up some other ideas of the overall process and how do they fix some of these gaps potentially, or how do they streamline the process as they start evaluating potentially what part of the process takes the longest and looking to achieve this through automation. So we'll continue to put additional releases out here, and this is 100% driven through customer agency feedback into what are my problems, what are these gaps, can you help me solve this through a programmable way of automation. So you'll continue to get additional use cases out here within this community construct, whether it's out on GitHub or potentially a Docker repository or other kind of community-based repositories, as I mentioned earlier, or Ansible as well. We also put out a book for the storage administrators as they're trying to get up to speed. What does automation mean to a storage environment? It's a nice, easy read. My nice colleague over here actually wrote the book. So if you have additional questions, I did see a few of the books downstairs as well. But an easy read to start bridging, from the traditional storage mindset to the network. How does things I traditionally do, how do they map into an API world? And what does that data look like in the format of that information? And how do I kind of streamline this? Or how do I have more intelligent conversations with other organizations, whether it's the business or the DevOps team? This will help provide those language barriers as well, from what a programmer would traditionally speak to what a storage administrator speaks. So we have to get on the same language if we're going to start developing unique kind of use case applications that multiple aspects or multiple businesses within the organization can go achieve. So nice, easy read, 48 pages, and it does a great job of kind of providing that overview. And then for areas that you want to get deeper in, we also have opened up all of our education. It's free. So if you want to learn more about the Yang data model or what we've exposed through the APIs, they're all modular-based courses that are free online. And it's take them when you want. And most of them are 20 to 30 minutes at length. So very short, modular. You can focus on the area of importance to help you, again, continue to humanize or change in the way that you look at your overall infrastructure, whether it's on-prem or hybrid into a cloud-based architecture. Automation is really that pathway to start connecting some of these disparate kind of silos within the organization as we continue to move forward. So again, thank you for your time. I'll be around afterwards if you have any questions. But thank you again for sitting through the automation.